Ah, welcome back. Okay, let's talk about cultural change. I think one of the really important things that we always have to keep in mind is that culture is never static. Okay, culture is never static. What that means is that we are constantly changing. We're constantly growing. We're constantly diminishing. In some form or fashion, we're constantly being pulled in this direction or over here by different influences. Okay. When you have large cultures like the United States, you're going to find rapid culture change, right? Things that drastically take place and convert our ideas in a very rapid pace. And that's due to sort of the ideas and the and how the United States is organized and how people come here from all over the world bringing different ideas and different experiences and different religion and different languages and different food, right? So all of these things are coming in and having an impact, and we are becoming much more diverse in in our identity as Americans, as the United States, and that has created a ton of conflict, right? And we'll be talking about that quite a bit throughout the semester. What does this mean? Well, it's constantly changing, adapting, growing, and dying. Populations grow and diminish, change. In Colorado, one of the issues that we're facing is sort of urbanization. Right? It's people that are leaving the rural areas of Colorado and moving to places like Denver. And this happens to for all intents and purposes most metropolitan areas, in which we find that as rural communities they might grow a bit, but they might not have enough infrastructure, right? Or their schools might not be good enough, or there might not be jobs out there, especially when you bring in stuff like corporate farming and stuff like that, where they might buy up a bunch of smaller family-owned homes, homesteads or ranches or farms. What happens to those people and where do they go? Well, a lot of times they'll move from rural areas to urban areas to find work, to go to school, to find different opportunities. And that's where metropolitan areas really kind of flourish, is having all of these different opportunities, where rural environments don't always have as many opportunity. So you see a lot of people doing that. You also have stuff like media, right? So, let's say you're young folks, right? You're in your 20s, maybe getting married, maybe having a couple kids, and you see what it's like, all the stuff that you can do in a metropolitan area, all the fun that you can have in a metropolitan area, all the job opportunities that you can have. And you're like, you know, I don't have a lot of stuff to do here. So you have younger people that are looking for a different lifestyle because they see that lifestyle in movies, on TV shows, on the internet. They see all of this stuff, and it encourages them to come in and try and experience that stuff. They want more experience. They want more opportunity, and they see it through media. And so you don't see that as often. You don't see a whole lot of people leaving the metropolitan area for rural communities. And that's created kind of another big issue of what is happening to rural communities. What's happening to the populations there? Are they disappearing? Why are they disappearing? What is happening to these communities? And what happens to those communities when they finally disappear, right? that's a big issue. Let's see here. Okay. The makeup of culture. So, for instance, oftentimes there are a few things that sort of determine the general idealism behind a specific culture. In American culture, we oftentimes sort of relate to the American dream, right? And this has been a long-running topic, or idea within American society of what it means to be an American, right? What is it that we all strive for? And the American dream oftentimes comes down to owning your own home, being married, having 2.4 kids, a white picket fence around your nice little house, having a dog and a cat, or maybe you should just go with a dog. Cats are traitorous. Yes, they're cute, but have you ever seen a cat knock stuff off of a table for no reason whatsoever? Right? No justification. They just knock stuff over. Don't trust them. Don't trust cats. Anyway, so you've got this American dream, right? You have this idea of what we should all strive for. And that dream shares a lot of identity in it, right? This idea of freedom, right? I have the freedom to have a job, to be able to afford this home, to decorate it how I want, to have a family. And that's sort of what a lot of people see freedom as. Independence. I can choose where I live. I can choose what I do. I can have a car, or I can have 2 cars. I can do all of these different things. So you have these different ideals that sort of influence the general identity of that culture. But then you have these 4 different things that we're going to be discussing independently now, is these ideas of norms, values, symbols, and mental maps, and how they reinforce or conflict with or organize how we see our own cultures. So, norms. Let's see, in general, this is how people behave towards one another, right? This is, if you're driving down the road in the United States, you drive on the right side, right? If you see a stop sign, you stop at it, right? These are normal behaviors that we have all agreed upon to do, right? Wearing a seatbelt, right? When you're driving your car, you should wear a seatbelt. It's mandated by law, and we know that it's a good thing, because you don't want to get tossed out. It's safer that way. So we wear seatbelts. How we behave in the classroom, versus how we behave at your grandmother's house, right? Versus how you hang out with your friends. I mean, if you can hang out at your grandmother's house and behave the same way that, you hang out with your friends, well, then I would say you've got a really cool grandma. But that usually doesn't take the place because your grandma comes from a different culture, right? They're how they grew up versus how you grew up is going to be different. We have things like wearing a mask, right? Mask wearing is a part of our culture. It's highly contested for lots of different reasons. Justifiable reasons. Some people are told that they shouldn't. I am a full believer in science. And our epidemiologists and doctors and people who wear masks all the time are like, you should wear a mask. And so, for me to behave in the way that I normally do, I will wear a mask. But this is conflicted. This is an aspect of our culture that is receiving conflicting information. Not necessarily right information or truthful information, but information nonetheless. I say trust in science. It's proven to be pretty good so far. Continuing on. we have all these different reasons. We are oftentimes either consciously or unconsciously incorporating them into our normal behavior. Unconsciously, if we say observe someone behaving a certain way, and it has an impact on us. So, you might walk into a courtroom for the first time, and no one's ever told you, how to behave in a courtroom. But you sit there and you watch everyone else and how they behave, right? And then you get up there and you behave the same way. Because you have learned about this behavior. You haven't been told, you haven't been specifically taught it, but you have observed and learned that behavior. Or you can be in a class, and be told this is how you should behave, this is how you should do things, right? So there's a couple different ways on how you learn these different behaviors. Now, norms can vary within different groups. So norms can be different between men and women. How men behave and how women behave are oftentimes very different given any given circumstance. If we consider things like dating, right, and sort of these ideas of like what it means to be chivalrous, right? As a guy, you traditionally you were expected to buy dinner, right? You're the guy, so you should buy dinner. And so that's how it's been for decades, and it's still something that is still incorporated into a lot of our lives. Now, some of that is disappearing. Some of it's like I can pay for my own meal, or, if you're the woman, you pay for the entire meal. It's like, wow, that's crazy, right? That's bucking the norm. It's pretty cool. Kids. What's appropriate for kids' behavior versus an adult's behavior versus an elderly person in the society. What's appropriate for their behavior, right? We see different rules that go along with all of that. Even with like romance, what's appropriate for old people when they're dating, right? Are old people going to go to places like clubs and stuff and, get funky with it? Get down, get jivey. I don't know. There are different rules for how different age groups are going to engage in romance. So, what's appropriate for younger kids versus adults versus elderly folks, depending on the culture, can be very different, right? You might not see grandma and grandpa going out to the clubs and getting jiggy with it, So, yeah. Again, this can also be affected by things like race or ethnicity, sexuality, again, gender and gender identity. All of these things can have different impacts on social behavior. Me as a white guy and driving, if I get pulled over, I have never once in my life feared the police. Never once. And I get pulled over, it's because, I'm probably speeding, and the police officer comes up and I'm like, howdy, how's it going? And I usually have a nice conversation with them. That's the privilege of being a white guy, right? If you're a black man, right, your experience could very, very well be different, depending on where you live and what that culture is like. The fact that we have more people of color being killed by police is an issue. So things that can be privileged, because of race, or because I'm a straight guy, right? I don't have to worry about not being able to get married. It's never been a concern. If I wanted to get married, I can go get married, no problems. Don't even have to think twice about it. In fact, I don't even have to change my last name because I'm a guy, right? I don't have to change my last name. But my wife, oh yeah, tradition says that she's going to change her last name to meet my last name, right? Different expectations for different culture. My sister, who is married to another woman, their experience about being married and about being together and having even the opportunity to get married and be recognized as a married person is very different from mine, right? Because we've had different laws, different ideals about identity, about what is right and what is wrong, the morals, and the norms, and all of these things sort of fit together. Then we also have to talk about consequences. Okay, consequences when it comes to things like dealing with norms and breaking those norms. Right? Some norms have very little consequence if you break them. If you curse in front of your grandmother, right? She's probably not going to like it, and she might, whip out a wooden spoon and paddle you with it, right? If she's a mean grandma. Traditionally we don't curse in front of grandparents. It's not something we normally do, right? Cursing in front of your friends, there's no consequence, right? Because that's usually fun and they're cursing back at you. Cursing in front of a judge could get you thrown in jail, right? So breaking different norms has different consequences, right? So you can have one experience where there's little to no punishment versus having zero punishment versus possibly going to jail and paying a fine, right? So depending on those actions and depending on sort of the settings, that subculture that you're working within, you're going to have different consequences. And this can vary drastically in various communities. What we find appropriate in one environment may be very, very different than another. Values. Okay, so every culture has values. And these are what we consider to be right, true, a good life, and beautiful. These are the things that we find to be very, very important to us. Oftentimes, the things that we have included in our values are religious practices, right? Sort of the connection between you and God or the universe or whatever, right, usually has big time consequences, because not only is it just about you, but it's about the people around you too. They also share a lot of those values. And if you break those values, oftentimes there can be severe consequences, whether it's, in the form of a law or in the form of some sort of social punishment. So yeah, values are oftentimes things that are very hard to change. Norms you can change fairly easily, right? Depending on the situation. It might take a little while to do it, but norms can be changed. Values, on the other hand, are very difficult to change. They can be adapted to, they can sort of be modified a little bit, but for the most part, they're going to stick with it. And that's going to be sort of an identifier of that culture, right? What kind of values do you think, Americans and Coloradans and say like students of Metro or CCD have, right? What What are the different values that we all might share together, and different ideas, for America, we have like the American dream. For Coloradans, we have, what do we value here? We value the environment. We value exercise and doing stuff like that. As a student, what do you believe in? What are you trying to get out of the school? What kind of value do you find in education, right? By going to college and trying to better yourself, right? Not all values are shared to the same level, and some are contested. We value things like security, right? But when does security become too much? When does security become an issue in and of itself? And that can be a big issue as well. And security means a lot of different things, whether or not it's, if we're talking about like the police, right? And this is a huge topic within our current culture, is dealing with the idea of what is the role of police in today's society, and how we are interpreting the different voices that are combating each other, right? We see, for an example, I'll take sort of like the what's happened during the summer of 2020 with all of the riots and the Blue Lives Matters and Black Lives Matters, and even like the all cops are bad movement, right? And I think there's some really interesting things to sort of pick apart here, and it's about views, right? How people view certain things and what they're going to expect. We find that in a lot of ways, urban environments oftentimes see more violence. And it's partially because there's more people. And it also depends on, all kinds of things. Social justice, and we're going to be talking about racism and all of this, and how that affects policing and all of this stuff. But considering things like the fact that the all cops are bad folks that are saying that we should get rid of all cops, or we should change how cops behave. You go out into the suburbs and you usually don't run into any problems with those cops. And the people that are supporting a lot of the Blue Lives Matters folks live in suburbs and they never see problems with cops. Why would we want to defund the police when we're not seeing anything wrong with the police? Because our experiences are showing us that we don't have any issues here with police. Why would we want to defund them? Where in other environments where we're seeing a lot of the bad things that are happening with police, and there are some systemic issues that need to be dealt with, changing the role of police might be really beneficial. Police aren't necessarily trained to deal with things like mental health issues, and having a trained psychologist go out instead of police when dealing with that kind of stuff might be a better choice. There's all kinds of things that are changing that we can find conflict in because of where people are experiencing their own ideas of what justice is, right? So, some people are saying, we don't need to defund the police because police are just fine, because where they live, the police are just fine. Where other people are experiencing like, well, we're seeing, police brutality and all this stuff, and we need to change it. And, the perspectives are oftentimes different. And so if we can recognize why those perspectives are different, and as anthropologists, we can recognize that they are different, where they're coming from, and then how do we create a bridge that goes between them, right? And how do we create that dialogue that instead of shouting one thing over another thing, we communicate and say, well, this is where the problems are, this is where the problems aren't. How do we deal with both of these issues? Yeah, and we can debate a lot of that too. I think that's a really good thing to discuss and talk about. So yeah, things are oftentimes at conflict, especially when it comes to specific values we might hold, but are becoming more and more contested. Values are also very, very important. They're very powerful things that can drive people to do very incredible and difficult tasks. Joining the military. A lot of times people join the military because they might be in a long line of folks that have joined the military. They find that the idea of protecting the country is really important, and I need to do that to fulfill my duty as an American. And so these values can encourage people to do things that don't always seem like the safe thing to do, or the smart thing to do, or the whatever, right? It can get you to do incredible things. Joining a church, being a part of that community. It has powerful motivators that are very difficult to change. Symbols. So, like language is symbolic because we use like a spoken language. We use a written language. We can use pictures to convey information, What are other ways that we have symbols? So, if we look at, say, like religion, okay, what are some of the things that we can look at specifically within religion? And we'll take Christianity as an example here, that show us and has power or influence, right? Anytime you see the cross, right? Anytime you see the cross, you know what it represents, and you know the history that it represents. Even if you don't know specifically, you know that there are huge implications to whenever you see the cross, right? You know that if you're driving down the road and you see a cross or a little church-looking symbol on the road, you know that coming up at the next exit, there's probably going to be a church there. The Bible as a symbol, right, is very important. If we look at say like the government, right, the U.S. flag, the flag is a very good example of what a symbol is. It has a representation. We have a star for every state, 13 stripes for each of the colonies for the original colonies. So that can have a huge impact, right? The White House, right? The White House is a symbol of the presidency, of that power within the U.S. government. Money itself is a symbol, right? It represents an object that can be exchanged for other things, right? There's no intrinsic value in that paper, right? It's just paper. But if I take that dollar and I hand it to someone, and then they hand me back a taco, right? That dollar was a symbol for that taco, right? Hospitals, wearing a face mask, a stethoscope, these things are ideas that, or a big H, right? You're going down the highway and you need a hospital, and where do you go? Well, there's a big H coming up, and you see that big H, and you're like, oh, the hospital right here. Go over and do that. And then one of the things that, is always interesting to think about is how do those symbols what do they represent, and how are they associated with things like values, right? And we'll kind of jump into this in a little bit. Mental maps of reality, and this is how we see the world, right? As we grow, as we develop, as we engage in our culture, we start to organize information, right? And how that information is organized is this mental map, right? And we put things in different boxes and say, okay, this is one category, this is another category, going back to like the fruits and vegetables example of, these are both plants, these are both edible plants, why are we distinguishing them? What are the qualities of these things that we are saying this is a fruit and this is a vegetable, this is a tomato, and we don't know where the hell tomatoes belong because they're technically fruits, but we consider them to be vegetables, right? I don't like tomatoes. Anyway, so it's how we organize the world, right? It's how we see things. If we were to try and there's lots of ways that you can organize. I said not to use like a map example, and I usually don't like using a map as an example, but you can sort of have an idea of like even like geographically oriented, like let's say you live in Golden, right? So you live in Golden, your area of interest is going to be much larger in that area, right? Much larger in that area of Golden. You're going to have more knowledge about all the stuff that is around you that you can engage in, and it's a lot easier to understand that community. But you also live fairly close to Denver, and so you might do a lot of stuff in Denver, but that area, even though geographically is larger, that area might be a little bit smaller because you've got less of a grasp on everything that's there. And again, that can, be organized into understanding how things are grouped together and how we view race. When we get to the race portion of our lectures, one of the things that we're going to talk about is that, we see race in the United States as very distinct things that are based off of our skin color, right? Other cultures around the world don't necessarily break it down like that. They see race in different ways, right? And so we use it as a way to distinguish both people and where they fit into the world, whether it's right or wrong. We have been conditioned to organize these things together, and so recognizing that is really important to do, especially if you want to understand and combat things like racism. You have to understand where it comes from. Let's see. Mental maps are created through enculturation, right? Again, learning about your environment. As you're experiencing that environment, you're going to be like, oh, well, this goes with this and this goes with this, right? And that's how you sort of organize things. Why do we have a distinction between cars and trucks, right? What's the difference between a car and a truck? Well, trucks, you can put stuff in, you can carry stuff around, right? Yeah, but they're still vehicles, right? They're all vehicles, right? Why do we give things different names? And the other thing that we also have to understand is that our mental maps are constantly changing as we are adapting to new information, right? We might see things a certain way for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden we get bombarded with a lot of other information. We're like, oh, well, this is going to dramatically change how I view the world, and how I organize things, and what I put with different classifications, right? And this change can take place depending upon that type of information. How quickly you're exposed to it, how powerful that information is. So considering like Culture usually takes change over a long period of time. It usually takes decades, sometimes generations, to have major changes take place, and we'll be talking a lot about that. But the idea is that normally, the normal change of culture takes a long time, unless you have some sort of major event that takes place. If we consider things like World War II as a cultural event, right, and how it changed, the United States that was coming out of a Depression era into this machine, right, this war machine that started pumping out not only soldiers but equipment, and had a drastic impact on how we view women in the workplace. Right? You've got all these men that are going off to fight in the war that are leaving behind a lot of open spaces for women to come in and work, because at the time women were more or less relegated to the home, right? And having those housewifely duties, right? But all of a sudden wartime comes into place, and we find out that women are just as capable of running these machines and doing these jobs that were at one point seen as something that only men could do. And all of a sudden, this had a huge impact on how we look at work. Even work within our just normal jobs and stuff. We were like, oh, things are going to change, and they did. Right? It used to be that we were, this traditional idealized practice of work, is the man went to work and the woman would take care of the family, right? World War II came, changed all of that, right? All of a sudden it flipped it on its head and said, oh, women can work, and in some cases they like to work and want to continue working, and over the next couple of decades, the areas started to open up and are still opening up. Okay, I mean, let's be realistic, the United States finally got its first woman as a vice president. Okay, that's kind of a big deal, especially in a democratic, independent, freedom, organized culture, to still have these barriers that have yet to be crossed. These positions that haven't been picked up by a woman yet are at conflict with some of the ideals that we all hold. So, continuing on with that, let's see, time. I think time is also something that we really have to understand is a huge impact on culture, on change, and how we see the world. Time is a constant influence, right? We see change taking place here, and then over time, it will gradually change into something else, right? And so we oftentimes, especially early anthropologists, did not necessarily take time into consideration quite as much as we probably should have, basically because we looked at things in a static sense, and I'll explain more of that here in a little bit. So yeah, and then some things that, like wealth, what is wealth, right? And that's a very good question. Different cultures consider wealth to be different things. In the United States, we see wealth as having a lot of money and having a big house and having nice cars and nice things, expensive things, right? That's oftentimes associated with wealth. In American culture and other cultures, wealth can be being able to have a wealth of knowledge, right? Or a wealth of musical ability, or of artistic ability, right? That can be the things that make you wealthy within a community. So all of these things can, help us understand ideas of what it takes to be wealthy. And then again, with mental maps, where we see things like what is lawful and what is unlawful, right? How do we organize sort of these ideas about morality? And again, they can change over time, depending on different influences. They can stay, relatively stagnant. Like I said, it's never stagnant, but it can be really slow in change, depending on where you're living and what kind of outside impact is coming in. Okay, so we're going to take a break real quick, and we'll come back to this next section, and we'll go from there. Okay, see you in a few.